Close your eyes now and let yourself settle into a comfortable position. Take a deep, gentle breath, and as you exhale, feel your body beginning to relax. Tonight, we're going to journey together through the corridors of time, back to one of history's most magnificent and yet surprisingly unsanitary palaces, the Palace of Versailles, where golden halls and silk tapestries concealed some of the most peculiar hygiene habits you could ever imagine. Let your mind drift gently as we begin our exploration. Picture yourself standing at the gates of Versailles on a misty morning in the late 1600s. The sun is just beginning to peek through the clouds, casting a soft golden light across the vast grounds. The palace stretches before you like a dream made of stone and glass, its windows glittering like jewels in the early light. But as we draw closer, as we step through those ornate doors and into the world of Louis XIV, you'll discover that beneath all this beauty lay habits and customs that would seem utterly bizarre to our modern sensibilities. Tonight, we'll wander slowly through these halls, taking our time to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. We'll meet the courtiers and servants, the kings and queens who lived in this gilded cage, and we'll gently uncover the peculiar ways they managed their daily lives. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to be transported to this fascinating world where luxury and, shall we say, creative hygiene solutions existed side by side. The year is 1682, and King Louis XIV has just moved his entire court to Versailles permanently. Imagine the chaos, the excitement, the sheer magnitude of relocating thousands of people to what was essentially a construction site that had been transformed into the most ambitious palace Europe had ever seen. But with all these people suddenly living in one place, problems arose that no one had quite anticipated. Let's begin our journey by walking slowly through the palace gardens on a warm summer morning. The air is thick with the scent of roses and jasmine, carefully cultivated in geometric patterns that stretch as far as the eye can see. Birds chirp softly in the distance, and the gentle sound of fountains creates a soothing rhythm. But as we approach the palace itself, you might notice something unusual in the air. A mixture of perfumes, yes, but underneath something else entirely. You see, dear listener, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the understanding of hygiene was fundamentally different from our own. Water, particularly hot water, was viewed with deep suspicion. Many physicians of the time believed that water could carry diseases through the pores of the skin, and that frequent bathing could actually weaken the body's natural defenses. This belief wasn't born from ignorance, but from observation of what seemed to happen when people bathed regularly. They often did fall ill, though of course we now know this was more likely due to contaminated water sources rather than the act of bathing itself. So instead of water, the wealthy residents of Versailles relied heavily on what they called dry cleaning. Picture yourself in a grand bedchamber, silk curtains filtering the morning light into a soft, golden glow. A noble lady sits at her ornate dressing table, its surface covered with bottles and jars of various powders and perfumes. Her lady's maid approaches with a piece of fine linen cloth and begins the daily ritual of cleaning. First, the maid would carefully remove the previous day's undergarments, layers of silk and cotton that had absorbed the night's perspiration. Then, using the linen cloth, she would gently but thoroughly rub down her mistress's skin, paying particular attention to areas where sweat might have accumulated. This wasn't a quick process, mind you. It was slow, methodical, almost meditative in its thoroughness. The cloth would be changed several times during this process, each fresh piece slightly dampened with rosewater or another fragrant liquid. The maid's hands would move with practiced efficiency, but never hurried. There was something almost ritualistic about it. This daily cleansing that used no soap, no hot water, just careful attention and expensive fabrics. After this dry cleaning, powders would be applied liberally. Not just any powders, but carefully prepared mixtures of rice powder, crushed pearls, and aromatic herbs. These served multiple purposes. They absorbed any remaining moisture, provided a smooth, pale complexion that was highly prized, and added another layer of fragrance to mask any lingering odors. But perhaps you're wondering about their hair. Now here's where things become truly fascinating. Hair washing, as we understand it, was extraordinarily rare. Most nobles would go months, sometimes an entire season, without washing their hair with water. Instead, they relied on a process that would seem utterly foreign to us today. Picture a courtier, let's call him the Marquis de Maintenon, sitting in his private chambers as his valet tends to his elaborate wig. Yes, most of the hair you would see at Versailles wasn't actually growing from the heads it adorned. These wigs, made from human hair, horsehair, or even plant fibers, were masterpieces of the wig-maker's art, but they presented their own unique challenges. The process of maintaining these wigs was both labor-intensive and rather unpleasant. Each morning, the valet would carefully remove the wig from its wooden stand and begin the daily grooming ritual. First, he would shake out any inhabitants that might have taken up residence overnight. Lice and fleas were constant companions in this era, and wigs provided them with excellent hiding places. The valet would then use a fine-toothed comb to work through the hair, section by section, carefully removing any tangles. This alone could take the better part of an hour. The wig would then be brushed with special brushes made from boar bristles, which helped distribute the natural oils and any applied powders throughout the hair. Speaking of powders, the amount used on these wigs was truly extraordinary. White powder was the height of fashion, made from a mixture of starch, flour, and sometimes ground bones. The process of powdering was almost ceremonial. The courtier would sit very still, while his valet, wearing a cloth over his nose and mouth, would carefully dust the entire wig with a special puff or brush. The powder served several purposes. It absorbed oils and odors, certainly, but it also created that distinctive white or grey color that was so fashionable. However, this powder attracted moisture from the air, and in the humid climate of Versailles, it could become quite aromatic as the day progressed. Now let your mind wander to the great halls of Versailles during a typical day. The Hall of Mirrors, perhaps, with its 17 mirror-clad arches reflecting the light from 17 opposing windows. The room sparkles like a jewel box, filled with the rustle of silk and satin, as hundreds of courtiers move through their daily rituals of court life. But what you might not expect is the rather creative approach to managing certain biological necessities. You see, Versailles, for all its grandeur, was woefully under-equipped with what we would consider basic sanitary facilities. The palace, designed to house perhaps a few hundred people, was now home to thousands of courtiers, servants, and hangers-on, all living in remarkably close quarters. The result was a series of, shall we say, improvised solutions that would shock modern sensibilities. Take, for instance, the common practice of using chamber pots not just in private bedchambers, but virtually anywhere privacy could be found. It wasn't unusual for a courtier, during a lengthy court ceremony, to simply step behind a tapestry or into an alcove to relieve themselves into a portable pot, which a servant would later empty. But even more startling to our modern minds was the practice of simply making do wherever one happened to be. The garden walkways, the corners of grand salons, even the elegant staircases of the palace, all could serve as impromptu facilities when need arose and proper amenities were too far away. This wasn't born from a lack of manners or civilization, but from practical necessity. When you're wearing layers upon layers of elaborate clothing, corsets, panniers, stockings, garters, multiple petticoats, the simple act of using proper facilities becomes a production requiring multiple servants and considerable time. In a world where every moment was scheduled and every appearance at court was crucial to maintaining one's position, convenience often won out over propriety. The palace staff developed an entire system for managing these realities. Teams of servants, working in shifts throughout the day and night, would patrol the palace with buckets, mops, and aromatic herbs, constantly cleaning and freshening areas that had been utilized. They carried with them bundles of lavender, rosemary, and other fragrant plants, which they would scatter on the floors to help mask odors and provide a pleasant scent underfoot. Let's pause here for a moment and consider the servants themselves. Picture Marie, a young woman who has traveled from a small village in Normandy to seek employment at Versailles. She rises before dawn in the tiny chamber she shares with 3 other girls, deep in the servants' quarters where the ceilings are low and the windows small. Her day begins with the most intimate of duties, tending to the personal hygiene needs of the noble family she serves. Marie's morning routine starts with emptying and cleaning the chamber pots from her mistress's bedchamber. This isn't simply a matter of dumping contents and washing the pot. Each vessel must be carefully cleaned with a mixture of vinegar and herbs, then dried and polished until it gleams. The contents must be carried in special covered buckets to the designated disposal areas, far from the main palace, and the entire process must be completed with absolute discretion. After this, Marie assists with the elaborate dressing ritual we described earlier. But her duties go far beyond what we might imagine. She must also tend to her mistress's teeth, a process that would seem quite alien to us today. Dental hygiene at Versailles was creative, to say the least. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, people used small sticks with frayed ends or pieces of rough cloth to scrub their teeth. But more commonly, they relied on tooth powders, mixtures that could include anything from crushed eggshells and salt to more exotic ingredients like crushed coral or even powdered precious stones. Marie would prepare these mixtures fresh each morning, carefully grinding ingredients with a mortar and pestle until they formed a fine powder. The process was meditative, almost peaceful, as the stone pestle moved in slow circles, gradually breaking down the various components into a smooth, consistent mixture. But perhaps most unusual to our modern understanding was the practice of using urine as a mouth rinse. Yes, you heard correctly. Urine, particularly that of young children, was believed to have medicinal properties and was commonly used for dental care. Marie might collect this precious liquid in small vials, allowing it to age for several days before it was considered ready for use. The process of applying these dental treatments was elaborate and time-consuming. Marie would first help her mistress rinse her mouth with the aged urine, swishing it carefully around her teeth and gums before spitting it into an ornate basin. Then, the tooth powder would be applied, rubbed vigorously against the teeth with the cloth or stick, followed by another rinse. The irony, of course, is that these practices, while seemingly bizarre to us, often caused more dental problems than they solved. The abrasive powders wore away tooth enamel, and the acidic urine rinses created an environment where bacteria could flourish. Many nobles at Versailles suffered from terrible dental problems, with blackened, rotting teeth that they tried desperately to conceal behind fans and carefully practice smiles. Now let your imagination drift to the grand dining halls of Versailles, where elaborate feasts were not just meals, but theatrical performances of wealth and power. Picture the long tables groaning under the weight of silver platters, crystal goblets catching the light from hundreds of candles, and courtiers dressed in their finest silks and jewels. But here, too, hygiene practices would surprise modern observers. The concept of individual place settings was still evolving, and it was common for multiple people to share drinking vessels, eating utensils, and even plates. A goblet of wine might pass from hand to hand around the table, each person drinking from the same vessel that had just touched the lips of their neighbor. Forks were still relatively new to French dining and were viewed with some suspicion. Many courtiers continued to eat with their hands, as had been the custom for centuries. This meant that communal washing bowls were placed throughout the dining room, filled with water scented with rose petals or herbs. Diners would dip their fingers into these bowls throughout the meal, drying them on shared napkins that hung from the table. The challenge, of course, was that these washing bowls were used by dozens of people throughout a single meal, and the water was rarely changed. By the end of an evening feast, the once clear water had become murky with grease, food particles, and, well, whatever else dozens of hands might contribute. Table manners of the era included some practices that were specifically designed to address hygiene concerns, though they might seem odd to us today. For instance, it was considered proper to wipe your hands on the tablecloth rather than your own clothing, the reasoning being that the tablecloth would be washed by servants, while your clothing might not be cleaned for weeks or months. Spitting was not only acceptable but expected during meals. Special spittoons were placed around the dining room, and diners would regularly expectorate into them throughout the evening. This wasn't considered rude or disgusting, but rather a sign of good health and proper digestion. Let's move now through the palace corridors as evening approaches. The light from the tall windows is growing soft and golden, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Servants move quietly through the halls, lighting candles and oil lamps for the evening's activities. But as darkness falls, other challenges emerge. Nighttime at Versailles presented particular hygiene challenges. The palace, despite its grandeur, was poorly lit by modern standards. Navigating to proper facilities in the dark was treacherous, especially when wearing elaborate court dress and possibly after an evening of wine and festivities. This led to the widespread use of what were delicately called convenience chairs, essentially portable commodes that could be placed in bedchambers or private sitting rooms. These weren't simple affairs, but elaborate pieces of furniture, often upholstered in silk and decorated with the same care as any other piece of court furniture. The most wealthy courtiers had convenience chairs that were works of art in themselves. Imagine a chair that looks perfectly normal from the outside, upholstered in burgundy velvet perhaps, with golden trim and elegant curved legs. But lift the seat, and you'd find a fitted porcelain bowl, often decorated with delicate painted flowers or family crests. The process of using these chairs was attended by servants who would bring them to the desired location, ensure privacy, and then discreetly remove and clean them afterward. The porcelain bowls were often decorated so beautifully that they resembled fine dinnerware, which in a way they were, just serving a very different purpose. But let's turn our attention now to perhaps the most elaborate hygiene ritual at Versailles, the morning levee of the king himself. This wasn't simply a matter of getting dressed, but a complex ceremony that could last for hours and involve dozens of participants, each with their own specific role in the process. Picture the king's bedchamber as the sun rises. Heavy curtains of gold brocade are drawn back to let in the morning light, revealing a room that is more like a small theater than a bedroom. The bed itself is enormous, surrounded by a balustrade that keeps spectators at a respectful distance. The king lies sleeping under covers of the finest silk, his nightcap perfectly arranged, his face peaceful in repose. The first person to enter this sacred space is not a nobleman, but the king's body servant, a man whose entire life revolves around the most intimate aspects of the royal person. This servant approaches the bed with almost religious reverence, carrying with him the tools he'll need for the morning's ritual. The first task is to gently wake the king, a process that must be done with perfect timing and absolute discretion. The servant whispers softly, "Perhaps, Your Majesty." The sun greets you and waits for the royal eyes to open. Once awake, the king doesn't simply jump out of bed as we might. Instead, he remains lying down, while the first phase of his morning hygiene routine begins. Still in bed, the king is presented with a basin of warm water. Not for washing, you understand, but for rinsing his mouth. This water has been specially prepared, heated to exactly the right temperature, and scented with herbs chosen specifically for their supposed beneficial properties. The king rinses his mouth carefully, spitting into a golden basin held by a kneeling servant. Next comes the ritual of examining the royal body for any signs of illness or distress. This isn't done by doctors, but by servants who know every inch of the king's skin, every mole and freckle, every scar and blemish. They look for anything unusual, a new rash, a suspicious bump, a change in color or texture that might indicate some health concern. This examination is thorough and methodical. The servant's hands move carefully over the royal skin, feeling for any abnormalities while maintaining the reverent demeanor appropriate to touching the person of the king. Any concerns are noted and will be reported later to the royal physicians, but the examination itself is conducted in silence, almost like a prayer. After this inspection, the real work begins. The king's body is carefully cleaned, using the dry method we described earlier, but with materials and techniques reserved only for royalty. The cloths used are made from the finest silk, so soft they feel like butterfly wings against the skin. They've been soaked overnight in water infused with rare flowers and exotic spices imported from the far reaches of the French Empire. Each area of the royal body receives individual attention. The servants work slowly, methodically, almost meditatively. There's something hypnotic about watching their hands move in gentle, circular motions, the silk cloths caressing the king's skin with reverent care. They start with the face, moving across the forehead, around the eyes, down the cheeks, carefully cleaning around the nose and mouth. The ears receive special attention, cleaned with small, silk-wrapped sticks that have been dipped in warm, scented oil. The process is so gentle, so careful, that the king often falls back asleep during this portion of the ritual. The servants continue their work in whispered silence, their movements becoming even more careful to avoid disturbing the royal slumber. When they reach the king's hands, each finger is individually cleaned, the nails carefully examined and trimmed if necessary. The fingernails themselves are a work of art, kept perfectly shaped and polished to a high shine. Some kings even had their nails painted with clear lacquers or tinted with subtle colors, a practice that was considered the height of sophistication. The feet receive equally careful attention. Each toe is individually cleaned, the spaces between them carefully attended to with small brushes made from the softest animal hair. The toenails are trimmed and shaped, and the soles of the feet are massaged with oils that have been warming by the fire since before dawn. But perhaps the most elaborate part of this morning ritual involves the king's hair, or rather his scalp, since his actual hair will soon be covered by an elaborate wig. The scalp is carefully massaged with oils that are believed to promote healthy hair growth and prevent balding, a constant concern for men of this era. These oils are exotic mixtures that might include bear grease, rare plant extracts, and even powdered gemstones. The massage itself is performed with almost religious intensity, the servant's fingers working in slow circular motions across every inch of the royal scalp. The king's eyes often close during this process, and you can see the tension leaving his face as the warm oils and gentle massage work their magic. After the scalp massage, any remaining natural hair is carefully combed and arranged. Even though it will soon be covered by a wig, the king's own hair must be perfectly groomed. You never know when the wig might be removed, and the royal person must always appear immaculate. Now comes the moment when other courtiers are allowed to enter the royal bedchamber to witness the dressing ceremony. But first, let's pause to consider what an extraordinary privilege this was. To be present at the king's levee was a sign of tremendous favor, and the hierarchy of who could enter when was strictly controlled. The first to be admitted might be the king's brother or his closest male relatives. They enter quietly, bowing deeply as they approach the royal bed. Next might come the highest-ranking nobles of the court, dukes and princes who have earned this honor through years of faithful service or strategic marriages. Each new arrival brings their own servants, and soon the bedchamber, large as it is, begins to fill with people. But everyone maintains perfect silence and dignity. This isn't a casual gathering, but a formal ceremony with rules as strict as any religious service. The actual dressing process is a marvel of choreography. Each piece of clothing has its designated handler. One person responsible only for the royal stockings, another only for the breeches, a third for the shirt, and so on. These servants have trained for years to perform their specific tasks flawlessly. Let's watch as the stockings are put on. These aren't simple socks, but elaborate silk constructions that reach to the thigh, often decorated with embroidery or subtle patterns. The servant responsible for this task approaches the bed with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. He kneels beside the bed and carefully gathers the first stocking, checking it for any imperfections. A loose thread, a pulled stitch, anything that might mar the royal appearance. The stocking is then rolled down to the toe, just as we might do today, but with infinite care and precision. The servant's hands are perfectly steady as he slips the silk over the royal toes, then slowly, gently works it up the royal foot and leg. The process is repeated with the second stocking, both servants working in perfect synchronization. Next come the breeches, elaborate silk garments that fit closely to the body and are decorated with ribbons, lace, and sometimes precious stones. The servant responsible for this task must help the king stand, supporting him while maintaining perfect balance and dignity. The breeches are slipped on carefully, adjusted and readjusted until they fit perfectly, then secured with ribbons that are tied in specific patterns that have been passed down through generations of royal servants. The shirt comes next. Not a simple garment, but a work of art made from the finest linen and decorated with lace that took months to create. The sleeves are particularly elaborate, with cuffs that extend well beyond the hands and are decorated with intricate patterns. Putting on this shirt is like dressing a sculpture. Every fold must fall perfectly, every ribbon must be precisely tied. But we haven't yet addressed one of the most challenging aspects of royal hygiene, the king's undergarments. In an era when changing clothes was a major undertaking, undergarments were typically worn for extended periods. The king might wear the same linen undershift for a week or more, and this garment had to be managed carefully to prevent odors and maintain hygiene. The solution was layers of perfumed powders and sachets sewn into the garments themselves. These undergarments were literally stuffed with aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, and more exotic spices. As the king moved throughout the day, these herbs would release their fragrances, helping to mask any natural odors and providing a pleasant scent. The changing of these undergarments, when it did occur, was almost as elaborate as the daily dressing ritual. Special servants, sworn to absolute secrecy about anything they might observe regarding the royal body, would carefully remove the old garments and dress the king in fresh ones. The old undergarments wouldn't be simply discarded. They would be carefully cleaned and prepared for future use, a process that could take days. Now, as we watch the dressing ceremony continue, let's consider the wigs. The wigs of Versailles. They deserve their own chapter in the history of personal grooming. These weren't simple hairpieces, but architectural marvels that could weigh several pounds and require their own specially trained servants to maintain. The king's collection of wigs was enormous. Dozens of different styles for different occasions, different seasons, different moods. Each wig was a masterpiece of the wigmaker's art, crafted from the finest human hair and styled in the elaborate fashions of the day. Some were relatively simple, if you can call any wig at Versailles simple, while others were towering constructions that added 2 feet or more to the wearer's height. The daily selection of which wig to wear was itself a significant decision. The king's valet de chambre would present several options, each on its own wooden head, arranged on a special table like a collection of sculptures. The king would consider each one carefully, weighing the requirements of the day's activities, the weather, and his own mood. Once selected, the process of putting on the wig was delicate and time-consuming. First, the king's natural hair had to be completely flattened against his head and covered with a special cap that would prevent any of his own hair from showing. This cap was tied tightly under his chin and secured with additional ribbons at the back of his head. Next, the wig itself had to be carefully positioned. This wasn't simply a matter of placing it on the head. The wig had to be precisely aligned so that the hairline looked natural. The curls fell in exactly the right places, and the overall effect was perfectly balanced. The servant responsible for this task would make tiny adjustments, moving the wig a millimeter this way or that until the effect was perfect. Once in place, the wig had to be secured with pins, not just any pins, but specially crafted silver or gold pins that were themselves works of art. These pins had to be invisible once inserted, hidden within the curls and waves of the wig so that no hint of artifice would show. But the wig wasn't finished yet. Next came the powdering, that elaborate ritual we mentioned earlier. The king would be seated in a special chair, and servants would carefully drape cloths around his shoulders and across his clothing to protect them from the powder. Then, using special brushes and puffs, they would begin the process of applying the white powder that was so fashionable. This powdering had to be done with incredible precision. Too little powder, and the wig would look dingy and unkempt. Too much, and clouds of white dust would follow the king throughout the day, leaving traces on his clothing and anyone who came near him. The servants had to judge exactly the right amount, working the powder through the wig until every strand was perfectly coated. The powder itself was a carefully guarded recipe. The basic ingredient was usually wheat flour or rice starch, but to this were added fragrances, sometimes colored dyes for special effects, and various other ingredients believed to have beneficial properties for the hair and scalp. After powdering came the final styling touches. Using heated irons that had been warming by the fire, servants would carefully curl individual sections of the wig, creating the elaborate spirals and waves that were fashionable. This process could take an hour or more and required tremendous skill to avoid burning the delicate hair of the wig. Some wigs included additional decorative elements, jeweled pins, small ornaments, even tiny mechanical devices that could move or sparkle in the light. The king had one wig that included a small music box hidden in its construction, which would play a gentle melody when he turned his head in a certain way. But let's not forget about the ladies of the court, whose hygiene and grooming rituals were even more elaborate than those of the men. Picture the Marquise de Pompadour in her private chambers, surrounded by an army of servants and an arsenal of cosmetic tools that would rival any modern beauty salon. The ladies' morning routine began even earlier than the men's, often before dawn, because the process of achieving the perfect court appearance could take 4 or 5 hours. Let's follow along as Marie Antoinette, in her later years at Versailles, prepares for a typical day at court. She wakes in her elaborate bed, surrounded by layers of silk curtains that have kept her warm through the night. But unlike the king, she doesn't remain in bed for her initial grooming. Instead, she moves to a special chair, more like a throne really, that has been positioned near the windows where the morning light is best. Her first task is the removal of the previous day's cosmetics. You see, ladies of the court wore makeup that was more like a mask. Thick layers of white paint, rouge, patches, and other decorations that completely transformed their natural appearance. Removing this makeup was almost like removing a second skin. The process began with warm cloths soaked in milk or cream, which helped soften the hardened cosmetics. Servants would gently press these cloths against her face, allowing the warmth and moisture to penetrate the layers of paint and powder. Then, using soft brushes and special scrapers, they would carefully remove the old makeup, working slowly to avoid damaging the delicate skin underneath. This process revealed the real face beneath, often pale and sometimes damaged by the harsh cosmetics of the era. Many of the white face paints contained lead, which gave them their smooth, porcelain-like finish, but also caused serious health problems over time. Ladies who had been using these cosmetics for years often suffered from skin problems, hair loss, and even more serious health issues. After the old makeup was removed, the real work of skincare began. The face would be washed with various cleansing lotions, some made from crushed pearls and rose water, others from exotic ingredients imported from the colonies. These weren't gentle, modern cleansers, but harsh mixtures that often left the skin red and irritated. Next came the moisturizing treatments. Ladies applied layers of creams and oils, many of which contained ingredients that would shock us today. Crocodile fat was considered excellent for preventing wrinkles. Nightingale droppings were believed to give the skin a luminous glow. Snail slime was thought to have healing properties for damaged skin. These treatments were applied in specific patterns, with servants massaging them into the skin using techniques that had been passed down through generations. The massage itself could take an hour or more, with different preparations being applied to different areas of the face and neck. While these skincare treatments were being absorbed, attention would turn to other areas. The hands and arms would be treated with bleaching agents designed to maintain the pale complexion that was so prized. Many of these bleaching treatments contained mercury or arsenic, substances we now know are extremely toxic, but which were believed to be beneficial for the skin. The feet, despite being hidden under elaborate shoes and stockings, received equal attention. They would be soaked in warm water, scented with herbs, then massaged with oils and creams. The toenails would be carefully shaped and sometimes painted with subtle colors or decorated with tiny jewels. But perhaps the most time-consuming part of a lady's morning routine was the hair preparation. Like the men, ladies at Versailles rarely washed their hair with water. Instead, they relied on elaborate arrangements of false hair, wigs and hair pieces that created the towering hairstyles that were fashionable. The process began with the lady's own hair, which had to be carefully arranged as a foundation for the artificial additions. Her natural hair would be combed with special combs made from ivory or silver, then coated with pomades and oils designed to make it more manageable. These pomades were elaborate mixtures that might include bear grease, goose fat, and various aromatic oils. The smell was distinctive, to say the least, but it was considered a sign of wealth and sophistication. The more exotic the ingredients in your hair pomade, the higher your status at court. Once the natural hair was prepared, the process of adding the false hair began. This wasn't simply a matter of putting on a wig, but of carefully integrating dozens of individual hair pieces to create a single elaborate hairstyle. Curls, braids, and ornaments were woven together in patterns that could reach several feet in height. The most elaborate hairstyles included not just hair, but miniature scenes and decorations. A lady might wear a hairstyle that depicted a famous battle, complete with tiny soldiers and cannons. Another might choose a pastoral scene with small trees, animals, and shepherdesses. These weren't painted decorations, but three-dimensional constructions built right into the hair. Creating these hairstyles required teams of specialists, not just hairdressers, but miniature sculptors, painters, and engineers who could design the mechanical elements that made some decorations move or change throughout the day. The lady would sit perfectly still for hours while these artists worked, and the finished hairstyle was expected to last for days or even weeks. But maintaining these elaborate hairstyles presented unique challenges. The lady couldn't lie down normally, so special, tall, narrow beds were constructed that allowed her to sleep sitting up. Special pillows were designed to support these hairstyles without disturbing them. And throughout the day, servants would follow discreetly behind, ready to make small adjustments if any part of the construction began to sag or shift. The hygiene challenges of these hairstyles were significant. Food particles from meals would inevitably find their way into the elaborate constructions. Dust and dirt from the palace corridors would accumulate in the curls and decorations. And, most challenging of all, insects would take up residence in the warm, dark spaces within the hair. Special long, thin tools were developed for extracting unwanted inhabitants from these hairstyles. Ladies would carry small ivory picks that could be discreetly inserted into their hair to dislodge any creatures that had made themselves at home. Some ladies even kept small pets, trained mice or ferrets, that could be sent into the hairstyle to hunt for larger intruders. The process of eventually dismantling these hairstyles was almost as elaborate as creating them. When the time came, usually after a week or two, teams of servants would carefully remove each element, cataloguing and storing the artificial pieces for future use. The lady's natural hair, finally released from its elaborate prison, would often be found to be matted, tangled, and sometimes damaged from the weight and tension of the construction. Now let's turn our attention to some of the more unusual hygiene practices that were common at Versailles. These weren't born from ignorance or barbarism, but from genuine attempts to solve real problems with the limited knowledge and technology available at the time. Take, for instance, the practice of using live animals as part of personal hygiene routines. This might sound bizarre to our modern ears, but it was based on medical theories that were taken very seriously at the time. Small dogs, particularly spaniels, were often kept specifically for their supposed health benefits. These dogs would be bathed in special aromatic waters, then allowed to sleep in their owner's bed, pressed close against their body throughout the night. The theory was that the dog's natural body heat and the movement of their breathing would help regulate their owner's circulation and prevent various ailments. More unusually, some courtiers kept small animals specifically for their hygienic properties. Ferrets were sometimes used to clear blocked nasal passages. The animal would be gently coaxed to explore the nasal cavity, their natural curiosity helping to dislodge blockages that conventional methods couldn't reach. Leeches, of course, were commonplace, but at Versailles they were used not just for medical bloodletting, but for cosmetic purposes. Ladies would apply leeches to their temples or behind their ears, believing that the removal of small amounts of blood would give them a fashionable pallor and reduce any puffiness around the eyes. The care and maintenance of these medicinal leeches was itself a specialized art. They were kept in special glass containers filled with spring water, and their diet was carefully controlled to ensure they were healthy and effective. Some ladies had personal leech keepers, servants whose only job was to maintain these creatures and apply them when needed. But perhaps even more unusual was the practice of using human urine not just for dental care, but as a general health tonic. The urine of young, healthy individuals was considered particularly valuable, and it was not uncommon for wealthy courtiers to employ children specifically to provide this resource. These children, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, would be fed special diets designed to produce the highest quality urine. They would eat only the finest foods, fresh fruits, pure spring water, certain herbs believed to have beneficial properties. Their urine would then be collected in ornate vessels and aged like fine wine, sometimes for months, until it reached what was considered the perfect consistency and potency. The consumption of this aged urine was surrounded by elaborate ritual. It would be served in precious goblets, sometimes mixed with wine or flavored with honey and spices to make it more palatable. Ladies would sip it delicately while discussing the weather or the latest court gossip, as if they were enjoying an exotic tea. Now let your mind drift to the palace kitchens, where the preparation of food presented its own unique hygiene challenges. These weren't small, intimate spaces, but vast caverns filled with enormous fireplaces, massive copper pots, and teams of cooks working around the clock to feed the thousands of people who called Versailles home. The head chef, a man of considerable importance in the palace hierarchy, would arrive before dawn to begin planning the day's meals. But his first task wasn't to start cooking. It was to inspect the ingredients that had arrived during the night. This inspection was crucial because food preservation in the 17th and 18th centuries was a constant battle against spoilage. Picture him walking slowly through the storage areas, a candle in one hand and a small knife in the other. He examines each piece of meat, cutting small samples to check for signs of rot or disease. Fish are inspected for the cloudiness in their eyes that indicates they're no longer fresh. Vegetables are examined for the soft spots and discoloration that suggest they're beginning to spoil. But even when food was fresh by the standards of the time, it would often seem quite questionable to our modern sensibilities. Meat, for instance, was expected to have what we would consider a high smell, a strong, gamey odor that indicated it had been properly aged. The stronger the smell, the more flavorful the meat was considered to be. The process of preparing this aged meat involved techniques that would shock modern food safety inspectors. Carcasses would be hung in cool, dark rooms for weeks or even months, slowly developing the complex flavors that were prized by the sophisticated palates of the court. During this aging process, the meat would be visited regularly by various insects whose activities were considered part of the natural aging process. When it came time to cook this aged meat, the first step was often to scrape away the outer layer, which might be green with mold or black with other growths. This wasn't considered a sign that the meat was bad. Quite the opposite. The moldy exterior was seen as protection for the precious aged meat within, and removing it was simply part of the cooking process. The cooking itself took place over enormous wood fires that filled the kitchens with smoke and ash. Cooks worked in conditions that would seem unbearable to us: extreme heat, poor ventilation, and constant exposure to smoke and grease. They wore special clothing designed to protect them from the heat and flames, but even so, burns and injuries were common. The serving of food presented its own hygiene challenges. Dishes had to be carried through long corridors and up multiple flights of stairs before reaching the dining rooms. During this journey, they were exposed to dust, debris, and whatever else might be floating through the palace air. Servants learned to cover dishes with elaborate cloths and sometimes even small tents to protect them during transport. But once the food reached the dining room, the real challenges began. Remember, there were no individual place settings as we know them today. Instead, large platters of food were placed in the center of long tables, and diners would reach across each other to serve themselves. This meant that every dish was touched by multiple hands, and cross-contamination was inevitable. The serving utensils themselves were shared among dozens of people during a single meal. A spoon used to serve soup might pass through 20 different hands before the course was finished. These utensils were occasionally rinsed in the communal washing bowls we mentioned earlier, but thorough cleaning between uses was impossible. Let's pause here and consider the enormous challenges faced by the palace laundry staff. In an era when a single outfit might contain dozens of separate pieces, layers of undergarments, stockings, breeches, shirts, coats, accessories, and when each of these pieces was made from delicate fabrics that required special care, keeping the court properly dressed was a monumental undertaking. Picture the palace laundry as the sun rises, a series of large rooms filled with enormous wooden tubs, steaming cauldrons, and long tables for sorting and folding. The air is thick with steam, and the scent of the harsh soaps used to clean the delicate fabrics. Teams of women work in shifts around the clock because the laundry never stops. The process began with sorting, a complex task that required intimate knowledge of fabrics, dyes, and the specific requirements of different garments. Silks had to be separated from cottons, whites from colors, delicate laces from sturdier materials. Each category required different cleaning methods, different temperatures, different soaps. The actual washing was done in wooden tubs filled with water that had been heated over wood fires. The water itself was often questionable, drawn from wells that might be contaminated or from rivers that served as disposal sites for various waste products. But it was the best available, and it was carefully strained through cloth filters to remove the largest impurities. The soaps used were harsh by modern standards, made from animal fats and strong alkalis that could remove stains but also damage delicate fabrics. Laundresses had to judge exactly how much soap to use, how long to leave garments soaking, how vigorously to scrub them. Too little cleaning and stains would remain, too much and expensive clothing would be ruined. Some stains required special treatment. Blood, which was common on clothing due to the medical practices of the era, was treated with cold water and salt. Grease stains were attacked with mixtures of chalk and vinegar. Wine stains, perhaps the most common of all, were treated with white wine, the theory being that the alcohol in the wine would dissolve the staining compounds. But the most challenging stains were those left by the cosmetics and perfumes used by the court. The lead-based face paints left marks that were almost impossible to remove completely. The heavy oils and pomades used on hair would transfer to collars and pillows, creating stains that grew darker and more set with each washing. After washing, the garments had to be dried, not a simple task in the often damp climate of Versailles. Large drying rooms were heated by fires and filled with lines and racks where wet clothing could be hung. But even in these heated rooms, delicate fabrics could take days to dry completely, and the constant moisture created perfect conditions for mold and mildew. The ironing process was perhaps the most skilled part of the entire operation. The irons themselves were heavy pieces of metal that had to be heated over fires until they reached exactly the right temperature. Too cool, and they wouldn't remove wrinkles. Too hot, and they would scorch or burn the delicate fabrics. Different fabrics required different ironing techniques. Silks had to be ironed while still slightly damp, with a cloth placed between the iron and the fabric to prevent damage. Laces required special small irons that could work around delicate patterns without catching or tearing. Velvets couldn't be ironed at all. Instead, they had to be steamed and brushed to restore their texture. The most elaborate garments required teams of specialists working together. A single court dress might take a dozen women an entire day to clean, dry, and prepare for wearing. Every ribbon had to be pressed, every piece of lace had to be carefully shaped, every decorative element had to be cleaned and restored. But despite all this effort, clothing at Versailles was rarely truly clean by modern standards. The harsh soaps and primitive washing methods could remove some stains and odors, but they couldn't eliminate the deep-seated grime that built up over time. Most garments retained a permanent odor, a mixture of perfume, body oils, smoke from fires and candles, and the various other scents that permeated palace life. This is why perfume became such an important part of court life. It wasn't just a luxury or a fashion statement. It was a practical necessity for masking the odors that were an inevitable part of daily life. The perfumes used at Versailles were incredibly strong by modern standards, designed not to enhance natural scents, but to overpower less pleasant ones. Let's explore now the fascinating world of Versailles perfumery. Picture a small, windowless room deep in the palace, filled with hundreds of bottles, jars, and vials, containing every imaginable scent. This is the workshop of the court perfumer, a person of considerable importance whose creations could make or break a courtier's social success. The process of creating perfume at Versailles was more like alchemy than modern cosmetics. The perfumer would begin with base ingredients, often animal-derived substances, that provided the lasting power necessary for perfumes that had to mask strong odors for hours at a time. Ambergris, a substance produced in the digestive system of whales, was one of the most prized ingredients. It had a complex, musky scent that could hold other fragrances and make them last much longer on the skin. A single ounce of high-quality ambergris could cost more than a servant's yearly wages. Musk, derived from the scent glands of deer, was another crucial ingredient. Its powerful animalistic scent was considered highly attractive, but it had to be used carefully. Too much, and the perfume would be overwhelming. Too little, and it wouldn't have the lasting power needed to combat the various odors of court life. To these animal bases were added plant-derived fragrances, rose oils from Bulgaria, jasmine from southern France, exotic spices from the colonies. But even these plant ingredients were processed in ways that would seem extreme to modern perfumers. Rose petals might be buried in animal fat for months to extract their essence. Jasmine flowers would be layered with goose fat and left to age until the fat was completely saturated with their scent. The final stage of perfume creation involved blending these various elements in proportions that were jealously guarded secrets. Each perfumer had their own formulas, passed down through generations or developed through years of experimentation. The process of blending was done by smell alone. There were no chemical analysis or scientific measurements, just the perfumer's nose and years of experience. The finished perfumes were incredibly concentrated, much stronger than anything we use today. They were designed to be applied liberally, not just to the skin, but to clothing, hair, and even furniture. A single application was expected to last for days, gradually releasing different notes as it aged on the wearer's body. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of Versailles perfumery was the practice of creating personalized scents for individual courtiers. These weren't simply favorite fragrances, but carefully crafted compositions designed to complement each person's natural body chemistry and social position. The process of creating a personalized perfume began with an extensive consultation. The perfumer would spend hours with the client, not just discussing preferred scents, but observing their lifestyle, their diet, their health, even their emotional state. All of these factors were believed to influence how a perfume would smell on a particular person. The perfumer would then create small test batches, often dozens of variations, which the client would wear for several days each. The goal was to find a combination that not only smelled pleasant, but also worked with the person's natural scent to create something unique and memorable. Some of these personalized perfumes became famous throughout the court. Marie Antoinette's signature scent, created specially for her, was said to combine the innocence of white flowers with hints of more exotic, sensual ingredients. The recipe was so closely guarded that when she was imprisoned during the Revolution, loyal servants smuggled small vials of it to her cell, believing that wearing her familiar perfume would provide some comfort during her ordeal. But perfume wasn't just worn on the body. It was used throughout the palace in ways that might surprise us today. Furniture was regularly treated with perfumed oils to help mask the odors that accumulated in the heavily used palace rooms. Curtains and tapestries were sprayed with scented waters. Even the floors were sometimes washed with perfume solutions. The most elaborate use of perfume was in the creation of scent stories, carefully orchestrated fragrances that would change throughout an event or ceremony. A courtier might begin an evening wearing one perfume, then discreetly apply different scents as the night progressed, creating an evolving olfactory experience for those around them. These scent stories were particularly popular during the elaborate court ceremonies that were such an important part of Versailles life. Imagine attending a royal wedding where the bride's perfume tells the story of her journey from innocence to married life, with each stage of the ceremony marked by a new fragrance being released into the air around her. The logistics of creating these scent experiences were incredibly complex. Teams of servants would be positioned throughout the palace, ready to release specific fragrances at predetermined moments. Hidden containers of perfume would be placed in walls and furniture, designed to release their contents when triggered by hidden mechanisms. Some of the most important state occasions featured perfumes that were visible as well as aromatic. Colored powders that released fragrances when disturbed would be scattered on floors where important guests would walk. Fountains would be filled with perfumed waters that would scent the air as they flowed. Even the candles used to light these events were specially made with perfumed wax that would release different fragrances as they burned. Now, as our journey through the hygiene habits of Versailles draws toward its close, let's take a moment to consider the broader implications of what we've discovered together. These practices, which might seem bizarre or even disgusting to our modern sensibilities, were the result of intelligent people doing their best to solve real problems with the knowledge and resources available to them. The courtiers of Versailles weren't ignorant of cleanliness. They were deeply concerned with it. But their understanding of how to achieve and maintain cleanliness was fundamentally different from ours. They lived in a world without antibiotics, without understanding of germ theory, without the luxury of unlimited hot water and effective soaps. Their solutions were creative, sometimes ingenious, and always adapted to their specific circumstances. The dry cleaning methods they used, while different from our water-based approach, were actually quite effective at removing oils and odors from the skin. The elaborate perfumes they created served not just aesthetic purposes, but practical ones, helping to create more pleasant living conditions in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Even their most unusual practices, like the use of urine in dental care or the consumption of it as a health tonic, were based on medical theories that made sense within the context of their understanding of human health. These weren't random superstitions, but treatments prescribed by the most learned physicians of the day. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can appreciate the ingenuity and adaptability that these long-ago courtiers displayed. They faced challenges that we can barely imagine, living in close quarters with thousands of other people, without modern plumbing or sanitation, without the benefit of modern medical knowledge, and they developed elaborate, sophisticated systems for managing these challenges. Their world was one of incredible luxury and beauty, but also of constant improvisation and adaptation. The same hands that created magnificent works of art also developed practical solutions for the most basic human needs. The same minds that conceived elaborate court ceremonies also figured out how to make life livable in conditions that would challenge anyone. In many ways, the hygiene habits of Versailles tell us as much about human resourcefulness and creativity as they do about historical practices. They remind us that every era has faced its own unique challenges, and that people have always found ways to adapt, to make the best of their circumstances, to create beauty and meaning even in the most difficult conditions. So as you settle into your comfortable modern bed, with your clean sheets and your central heating, with your hot water and your effective soaps just steps away, perhaps you can feel a sense of gratitude for the long journey that humanity has taken to arrive at our current understanding of health and hygiene. And perhaps, too, you can feel a connection to those long-ago courtiers who walked the halls of Versailles, who faced their daily challenges with creativity and determination, who found ways to live with dignity and grace, even in circumstances that tested their resourcefulness at every turn. The Palace of Versailles still stands today, its golden halls still gleaming, its gardens still perfectly manicured. Visitors from around the world walk through those same corridors where courtiers once navigated the complex world of court hygiene. The mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors still reflect light and movement, though they no longer reflect the elaborate wigs and painted faces of the old regime. But if you listen carefully, if you let your imagination reach back across the centuries, you might still sense something of that world. The rustle of silk, the whisper of secrets, the gentle sounds of a civilization that created its own unique solutions to the eternal human challenges of living together in harmony and health. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you gently through those golden halls where history and imagination meet in the soft, eternal twilight of memory.